My sister uninvited me to her wedding saying, "This is only for family," but demanded to babysit her ill-mannered kids during the ceremony. So I agreed, but then booked the best hotel in Hawaii and turned off my phone. I've always been the responsible one in our family, even though I'm the younger sister. My name is Elsie. I work as a marketing assistant at a mid-sized firm in the city. It doesn't pay amazingly well, but it's enough for me to cover my own expenses and help out my sister Diane. Diane is a widow with 2 boys, Tyler who's 8 and Mason who's 6. Her husband Greg died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving her to raise the kids alone. I felt terrible for her when it happened, so I immediately offered to help however I could. Our parents, Bob and Linda, live about 20 minutes away from both of us. They're in their 60s and have always favored Diane. I noticed this even when we were kids, but I tried not to let it bother me. Mom always said Diane needed more attention because she was sensitive, whatever that meant. After Greg died, Diane struggled to afford her apartment, so I started paying half her rent. I also cover a portion of her utilities, including the internet bill. It's tight on my budget, but I figured family helps family. That's what I was raised to believe anyway. Elsie could pay the whole rent if she wanted to, Diane said loudly at Sunday dinner last week. It's not like she has kids to support. I nearly choked on my mashed potatoes. Diane, I'm already stretching my budget as it is. I can't afford your entire rent. Mom shook her head. Elsie, your sister is struggling. You could cut back on those fancy coffee drinks you like. What fancy coffee drinks? I asked, confused. I brew coffee at home to save money. Dad chimed in. Your sister needs more help than you're giving her, Elsie. Family comes first. This kind of conversation happened almost weekly. No matter what I did, it was never enough. Meanwhile, Diane spent money on new clothes and salon appointments while I pinched pennies. But whenever I pointed this out, my parents acted like I was being petty. The worst part was how Diane handled her kids. Tyler and Mason were sweet boys at heart, but they had no discipline. Diane was always on her phone, barely paying attention to what they were doing. When she needed me time, which was often, she dropped them at my apartment with barely any notice. Last Thursday was the breaking point. I had a pounding headache after a stressful day at work. My boss had criticized my quarterly report, and I still had revisions to finish. Just as I sat down at my laptop, my doorbell rang. "Emergency girls' night," Diane announced when I opened the door. Tyler and Mason pushed past me into my apartment. The boys already had dinner. I'll pick them up around midnight. Thanks, sis. She was gone before I could object. I sighed and turned to my nephews, who were already jumping on my couch. Guys, please, stop that. I need to work tonight, and I have a headache. We want to play games on your laptop, Tyler shouted, ignoring me completely. No, I need it for work. You can watch TV quietly, okay? This set off a round of whining that quickly escalated to screaming. Mason grabbed my laptop while Tyler tried to wrestle it away from him. I saw red. Enough, I shouted, snatching my laptop back. Both of you, go sit in opposite corners right now. If you can't behave, I won't pay for your internet next month. Is that clear? Their eyes widened in horror at the threat. Suddenly, they were perfectly capable of following directions. They sat quietly in the corners, occasionally shooting me resentful looks. After 15 minutes, I let them watch a movie. They behaved for the rest of the evening, and I managed to finish my work. When Diane finally came to pick them up, at a.m. not midnight, they immediately started complaining. Aunt Elsie was mean to us. Tyler said, "She made us sit in corners. She said she wouldn't pay our internet," Mason added. Diane's face darkened. "You did what to my children?" "They were fighting over my laptop. I needed to work. How dare you discipline my kids? You have no right. You think paying some bills gives you the right to abuse my children? I could call the police for this." I was stunned. "Abuse, Diane? They were out of control. I don't want to hear it. Come on, boys. We're leaving." She stormed out, slamming my door so hard a picture fell off the wall. My phone rang 20 minutes later. It was Mom. "Elsie, how could you treat your nephews that way? After all your sister has been through? I raised you better than this." I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. As I lay in bed that night, I wondered when I had become the family villain simply for having boundaries. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse. 3 days later, Diane called me with exciting news. She'd met someone named Ryan at her yoga class. He was divorced, worked in finance, and was totally hot. I was genuinely happy for her. Maybe having someone new in her life would take some pressure off me. Over the next 2 months, Diane's relationship with Ryan became the center of her universe. She talked about him constantly, showing me pictures and relaying their conversations. Initially, I was thrilled for her. She deserved happiness after losing Greg. But my happiness quickly faded when I realized what her new relationship meant for me. "Can you take the boys tonight?" "Ryan's taking me to that new Italian place," Diane asked one Tuesday afternoon. It was the 3rd time that week she'd asked me to watch them. "I don't know, Diane. I've got a big presentation tomorrow I need to prepare for. Please. It'll just be a few hours. They'll be good, I promise." They weren't good. They never were. But I agreed because saying no to Diane meant enduring guilt trips from her and my parents. It became a pattern. Diane would drop off the boys with little notice, promising to be back early, then return hours later than planned. The boys' behavior worsened with each visit. They seemed angry about being pawned off so their mom could date, and they took it out on me in my apartment. One night, they spilled grape juice on my white sofa. Another time, they broke a ceramic bowl my grandmother had given me. After 8 weeks of this routine, I was mentally and physically exhausted. My work was suffering, my apartment was constantly a mess, and I had no social life of my own. Something had to change. Sunday dinner at my parents' house seemed like a good opportunity to address the situation. Diane was in an excellent mood, having just returned from a weekend getaway with Ryan. The boys were running around the backyard while we sat at the patio table. "Diane," I said carefully, choosing my words, "I'm really happy that things are going so well with Ryan. But I need to talk about the babysitting situation." My sister's smile faltered. "What about it?" It's become really frequent, and usually without much notice. I work full-time too, and I need some evenings to myself. Maybe we could set up a schedule, or find another babysitter for some nights." Diane's face hardened. "You're just being selfish. You don't want to spend time with your own nephews." "That's not what I said. You're jealous." She stood up, pointing her finger at me. "You're jealous that I found someone, and you're still single. That's what this is really about." I looked at my parents, expecting them to intervene, to point out how ridiculous Diane was being. Instead, Mom nodded in agreement. "Elsie, your sister finally has a chance at happiness again. Can't you put your own needs aside for once?" Mom said. Dad crossed his arms. "Family helps family, period." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Are you serious right now? I've been helping for years. I pay half her rent, part of her bills, and I've watched the boys constantly. I just need some balance." "Balance?" Diane scoffed. "Try raising 2 kids alone. Oh wait, you can't even manage to find a date." That was the final straw. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the deck. "I'm done. Find someone else to be your free babysitter." I quit. I walked out, ignoring Diane's screams and my mother's calls to come back. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders, despite the anger burning in my chest. 2 days later, Diane showed up at my door with the boys in tow. "I have a date with Ryan. It's important." "No," I said simply, blocking the doorway. "I told you I'm done babysitting." Her face contorted with rage. "You can't be serious. The boys are already here. Where are they supposed to go?" "That's for you to figure out. You're their mother." She tried to push past me, but I held firm. "You're trying to ruin my relationship," she shouted. "You want me to be alone forever like you?" I closed the door in her face and locked it. I could hear her pounding and yelling, but I turned up my TV and ignored it. Eventually, she left. The phone calls started that evening. First Diane, then Mom, then Dad. I let them all go to voicemail. My mother's message was particularly harsh. "You're driving yourself out of this family, Elsie. Prepare for the consequences." Despite our fight, I continued sending money for Diane's rent and bills. It felt like the last thread connecting me to my family, and I wasn't ready to cut it completely. Weeks passed. The calls and texts gradually stopped. I focused on work, started a yoga class, and even went on a few dates. For the first time in years, I was putting myself first. Then, after nearly 3 months of silence, My phone lit up with a text from Mom, family dinner tomorrow night at Carmine's, 7 p.m. Diane has news. Please, come. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe enough time had passed for things to cool down. Maybe Diane was ready to apologize. I texted back a simple okay, and spent the next day anxious about what awaited me. When I arrived at the restaurant, everyone was already seated, Mom, Dad, Diane, Tyler and Mason running around the tables, and a tall man with dark hair, who I assumed was Ryan. He stood and extended his hand when I approached. You must be Elsie, I've heard so much about you, he said with a warm smile. I doubted anything he'd heard was positive, but I smiled back. Nice to meet you, Ryan. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Ryan seemed normal, even occasionally shooting disapproving glances at the boys when they acted up. Diane was practically glowing, holding Ryan's hand on top of the table. Maybe things really had changed. After we ordered our food, Diane cleared her throat dramatically and reached for Ryan's hand. I have something important to share with everyone, she announced, her voice ringing with excitement. Ryan and I are getting married. My parents erupted in cheers. Dad clapped Ryan on the back while Mom wiped away tears. Congratulations, I said, genuinely happy for her. When's the big day? 4 months from now, Ryan answered. We found a perfect venue with a cancellation. That's wonderful news, I said. I'm really happy for both of you. Diane's smile suddenly hardened. There's something else you should know, Elsie. The tone of her voice made my stomach clench. The wedding will be small. Family only. She paused, staring directly at me, and I've decided not to invite you. The table fell silent. I felt like I'd been slapped. What? I finally managed. You heard me. This wedding is for people who act like family. You made it clear where you stand when you refused to help with my children. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to say something, to defend me. Mom looked down at her plate. Dad shook his head. Your sister's right, Elsie. You brought this on yourself. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 3 years of financial support, countless hours of babysitting, and all the emotional labor I'd put into helping Diane meant nothing because I'd finally set a boundary. I didn't say another word. I simply gathered my purse, placed some cash on the table for my meal, and walked out. No one called after me. That night, I made a decision. I blocked all their numbers and removed them from my social media. But I couldn't bring myself to stop the automatic transfer that paid Diane's rent. Life went on. I threw myself into work, made new friends at my yoga class, and even started dating a guy named Michael who worked at the coffee shop near my office. I was building a life that didn't revolve around my sister's needs, and it felt good. From time to time, I'd check Diane's social media. She posted regular updates about wedding preparations, dress fittings, cake tastings, venue photos. Not once did she reach out to me. Neither did my parents. 4 months passed quickly. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, and I was planning a quiet weekend at home with takeout and Netflix. Michael had invited me to a concert, but I declined. As much as I tried to pretend otherwise, I knew I'd be thinking about the wedding all day. Friday evening, I was making dinner when someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked through the peephole. To my shock, Diane was standing in the hallway. I hesitated before opening the door. Diane? What are you doing here? She pushed past me into the apartment. We need to talk. She looked stressed. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail instead of her usual perfect blowout. What's going on? I asked, crossing my arms. The wedding's tomorrow. Shouldn't you be at a rehearsal dinner or something? That's exactly what I want to talk about. She sat on my couch without being invited. I need you to watch the boys during the wedding tomorrow. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. You want me to babysit tomorrow? When you've specifically uninvited me from your wedding? Look, they can't come to the ceremony. They'll ruin everything. Tyler's going through a phase where he interrupts constantly, and Mason broke a vase at the venue during our last visit. So, hire a babysitter. I tried. 2 different ones canceled on me. Besides, your family. You should help. I laughed in disbelief. Diane, you literally told me I wasn't family enough to attend your wedding. You can't have it both ways. You're blowing that whole thing out of proportion. She waved dismissively. I was upset, okay? But this is important. If you don't help me, I'll have to bring them to the wedding, and they'll cause a scene. That sounds like a parenting problem, not an Elsie problem. Her face hardened. Fine. If you won't do it for me, do it because Mom and Dad want you to. They'll be really disappointed if you refuse. Mom and Dad haven't spoken to me in 4 months. They didn't even call on my birthday. If you don't agree, I'll tell them how selfish you're being. Again, you know they'll take my side. She smirked, confident in her leverage. I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest, but this time I didn't let it show. Instead, I forced a neutral expression. What time should I expect them? I asked. Diane's face lit up with victory. The ceremony starts at AM, so I'll drop them off around. We should be done with everything by PM. I'll text you if we're running late. Sure, I said flatly. She stood up, suddenly cheerful. I knew you'd come through, sis. This means a lot to me. After she left, I didn't waste any time. I called my boss, Mark, and asked for an urgent vacation. I had nearly 3 weeks saved up from the previous year. After he agreed, I hung up and immediately opened my laptop. Within an hour, I had booked a 10-day stay at a beachfront resort in Hawaii, with a flight leaving at AM the next morning. I'd always wanted to go to Hawaii, but had never been able to afford it, partly because I was too busy supporting Diane. The irony wasn't lost on me. I packed quickly, setting an alarm for AM to catch a taxi to the airport. As I zipped up my suitcase, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was guilt, of course. I'd been conditioned my whole life to put Diane's needs first. But underneath that was something else: excitement, freedom, and a delicious sense of finally standing up for myself. I slept fitfully that night, half expecting Diane to somehow sense my plan and show up to stop me. But my alarm went off without incident, and by sunrise, I was on a plane heading west. My phone switched to airplane mode. The flight attendant handed me a mimosa as we reached cruising altitude. "Celebrating something?" she asked with a smile. I took a sip and looked out the window at the clouds below. "Yes," I said. My independence. Hawaii was everything I'd dreamed it would be. The resort was located on a pristine beach with turquoise water and soft white sand. I spent my first day alternating between swimming, napping in a hammock, and drinking colorful cocktails brought by attentive staff. For the first time in years, I felt completely relaxed. I kept my phone off all day, knowing what would be waiting for me when I turned it on. Diane would have shown up at my apartment around AM, with Tyler and Mason in tow, probably already dressed in their little suits. She would have knocked, then pounded, then called repeatedly. By AM, she would have been frantic. By, furious. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I ordered room service breakfast, and as I sipped my coffee on the balcony overlooking the ocean, I turned on my phone. It immediately exploded with notifications. Missed calls from Diane. 8 from Mom. 5 from Dad. Dozens of text messages, each more desperate or angry than the last. From Diane at 9:45 a.m., "Where are you? We've been knocking for 15 minutes. From Diane at AM, "This isn't funny, Elsie. I'm going to be late." From Diane at AM, "I can't believe you'd do this to me on my wedding day." From Mom at AM, "Your sister is in tears. Is this really how you want things to be?" From Diane at PM, "You've completely ruined my wedding. The boys are out of control, and Ryan's family thinks I'm a terrible mother." From Dad at 2:30 p.m., "This is beyond disappointing, Elsie. You've gone too far this time." The final text from Diane came in at PM, "You've crossed every line. Don't bother trying to contact any of us again. You're not part of this family anymore." I should have felt devastated, but instead, I felt strangely liberated. They had cut me off, not the other way around. The decision was out of my hands now. I opened my banking app and canceled the recurring transfer for Diane's rent. Ryan could help her now. I turned my phone off again and went for a swim in the ocean. An hour later, I was lying on the beach when my cousin Rachel called. I almost didn't answer, but Rachel had always been kind to me. She'd been living abroad for the past few years and wasn't involved in the family drama. "Elsie, are you okay? I heard there was drama at the wedding. I got some angry texts. Sounds like the boys were a handful." "That's an understatement," Rachel said. "Diane had to bring them since you weren't there to babysit. Your parents tried to watch them during the ceremony, but they couldn't handle it. Tyler knocked over a flower arrangement during the bows, and Mason kept loudly asking when they could have cake. I tried not to smile but failed. During the reception," Rachel continued, "they were running around the table screaming. The worst part was when they decided to play with the cake before it was cut. They stuck their hands in it and started a food fight. Ryan's mother looked like she was going to faint." "Oh my God!" I gasped, half horrified, half amused. Ryan's aunt, she's quite proper, said something like, "Perhaps you rushed into this marriage. You could have heard a pin drop. Diane blames you for everything, of course." "Of course she does," I said. "It couldn't possibly be that her kids need discipline, or that she should have hired a proper babysitter weeks ago instead of assuming I'd do it." "Exactly. Anyway, I just wanted to check that you're okay. And honestly, I think you did the right thing. They've all taken advantage of you for years." After talking to Rachel, I pushed thoughts of my family aside and enjoyed my vacation to the fullest. I went snorkeling with sea turtles, took a helicopter tour over volcanic landscapes, learned a hula dance, and ate fresh pineapple every day. By the time I flew home, I was tanned, rested, and more at peace than I'd been in years. There were no new messages from my family. I hadn't expected any, but the finality of the silence still stung a little. 3 weeks passed, I threw myself into work, and my boss noticed the difference in my energy and focus. He called me into his office one Friday afternoon. "Elsie, I've been impressed with your performance lately," Mark said. "The Thompson account is our most profitable this quarter, and your marketing strategy for the Wilson launch was brilliant. I'd like to offer you a promotion to senior marketing strategist." I was stunned. "Thank you, Mark. I don't know what to say." "Say yes. It comes with a 15% raise in your own office. You've earned it." With my new salary, I could finally afford a nicer apartment. I found a 1-bedroom in a newer building with a gym and rooftop garden. Moving day was bittersweet. I was excited for my new place, but couldn't help thinking about how my family wasn't there to celebrate with me. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening as I was unpacking the last of my kitchen boxes, Rachel called again. "Hey, cousin," I answered. "How are you?" "I'm good. But I've got some family gossip. Thought you might want to know what's happening with Diane. Is she okay?" Despite everything, I still cared. Physically, yes. Emotionally, not so much. She and Ryan are fighting constantly, mostly about the boys. He wasn't prepared for how challenging they are, and Diane isn't doing anything to address their behavior. She's been dumping them with your parents nearly every weekend so she and Ryan can have alone time to work on their marriage. I shook my head. That's not solving the real problem. The boys need consistent boundaries, not to be passed around like parcels. Exactly. Your mom is exhausted, and your dad threw out his back trying to stop Mason from climbing the bookshelf last week. The whole situation is a mess. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I felt sad for Tyler and Mason. None of this was their fault. They were acting out because the adults in their lives weren't giving them the structure they needed. "I hope they figure it out," I said for the boys' sake. "Do you ever think about reconciling with them?" Rachel asked carefully. I considered the question. I don't know. They'd have to acknowledge how they treated me, and I'm not sure they're capable of that. But I miss the family we could have been, you know? I get it. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Sometimes you have to put yourself first. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on my new balcony, watching the city lights. I thought about my sister and my parents, about the nephews I probably wouldn't see grow up. There was sadness there, but no regret. I'd spent years being the family doormat, giving everything and receiving nothing in return. Breaking free had been necessary for my own well-being. Maybe someday they'd realize what they'd lost. Maybe they'd reach out with genuine remorse. Until then, I would continue building my life on my own terms. I had a job I loved, a beautiful new home, friends who respected me, and most importantly, I had myself stronger and more competent than I'd ever been. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to the future. Whatever it held, I was ready to face it on my own terms.